the weight of the world on her shoulders. The neon sign outside Manny's diner flickered against the dark sky, buzzing like a tired insect. The red glow cast shaky shadows onto the cracked pavement, reflecting off the puddles left behind from the evening rain. Inside, the scent of burnt coffee, fried bacon, and cheap disinfectant clung to the air, weaving itself into the very fabric of the place. Layla Monroe barely noticed anymore. She had been working here for 5 years, long enough for the scent to become part of her skin, long enough to know exactly how long the clock took to drag from 1 hour to the next, and long enough to know that her dreams of escaping this life were nothing but foolish fantasies. Her feet ached, her lower back pulsed with exhaustion, and her hands, raw from washing dishes, trembled slightly as she gripped the counter. The diner was nearly empty, just another quiet night on the graveyard shift. 2:17 a.m. 3 more hours to go. She sighed, pressing her fingers into her temples before grabbing the damp rag from her apron and wiping down the counter again. The routine was numbing. Scrub, straighten, repeat. At least the predictable nature of it all kept her from thinking too much. Thinking led to remembering, and remembering led to pain. A country song hummed softly from the radio in the corner, a sad tune about broken dreams and small towns. Layla had stopped paying attention to lyrics a long time ago. They all sounded the same to her now. The bell above the door jingled, and she instinctively turned her head. A couple walked in, looking out of place from the moment they stepped across the threshold. Layla knew the type. The woman wore a sleek, navy blue pantsuit, her designer heels clicking against the tile floor like a gavel sentencing the place unworthy. Her red lacquered nails tapped against the screen of her phone, not sparing a single glance at the surroundings. The man beside her was broad-shouldered and sharp-jawed, wearing a tailored coat that probably cost more than Layla made in 3 months. A silver watch gleamed on his wrist. They didn't belong here. And judging by the way the woman wrinkled her nose at the menu plastered above the register, she knew it too. Layla straightened her apron, pasted on her best customer service smile, and walked toward them, pen in hand. "Good evening. What can I get started for you?" The woman barely glanced up. "Coffee. Extra hot. And make sure it's fresh." Layla fought the urge to sigh. She knew that tone. It was the same one she had heard from doctors in hospital waiting rooms when her mother had fallen sick. The same one her landlord used when reminding her that rent was due in 2 days. It was the voice of someone who thought their time was more valuable than hers. She bit the inside of her cheek and nodded, coming right up. As she turned toward the coffee pot, she noticed someone else. A man had taken a seat at the far end of the counter, so quietly that she hadn't even heard him come in. He sat with an air of calm observation, his crisp white shirt unwrinkled under a dark coat. His posture was relaxed, his hands folded in front of him, and his eyes. They were watching her. Not in a leering way, not in an impatient way, just watching. Layla hesitated before approaching. "Can I get you anything?" The man looked up, his gaze steady. "I'm good, just watching." His voice was deep, smooth. There was no condescension in his tone, no impatience, just something steady, solid. A shiver ran down Layla's spine, not from fear, from something else. Before she could dwell on it, a sharp snap echoed through the air. "Waitress, hello." Layla turned back to the couple, her heart sinking. "Here we go." She poured the coffee with practiced efficiency, making sure it was fresh, piping hot, and undeniable proof that she had done her job correctly. People like this, she knew, didn't actually care about the coffee. It was about control, about seeing how far they could push someone before they snapped. She set the cup down with a steady hand. "Here you go. Let me know if you need anything else." The woman lifted the cup to her lips, taking a slow, exaggerated sip. Layla had seen this routine 100 times before, and yet she still felt the flicker of frustration creep up her spine when the woman grimaced and scoffed. "Are you serious? This is barely warm. Layla's fingers curled into her apron, the man across from her side, shaking his head like she had single-handedly ruined his night. We should have gone somewhere better. Layla knew better than to argue, better than to roll her eyes, better than to show any sign that she was affected. I can bring you a new one. The woman let out a dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes. You know what? Just forget it. I don't even want it anymore. Layla forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. No problem. She turned to leave, but before she could, the woman muttered just loud enough for her to hear. God, is it that hard to get a simple order right? Layla's stomach tightened. Don't react. Don't give them the satisfaction. She had bills to pay, a sick mother at home, a little brother who still needed new shoes for school. She couldn't afford pride. She walked back to the counter, pretending she couldn't feel the weight of their judgment pressing into her back. The laminated menu was peeling at the edges. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air conditioner rattled in its vent. And yet none of that compared to the exhaustion settling deep in her bones. She rubbed at the tension in her neck, exhaling slowly. The quiet man at the counter was still watching. Layla turned to him, raising an eyebrow. Something on my face. For the first time, he smiled. Just a little. You always let people treat you like that. Layla let out a dry laugh. You must not go to many diners. The man tilted his head slightly, considering her response. I go to plenty, but I don't see people handle it the way you do. Layla didn't know how to respond to that. Was it a compliment? An observation? She shrugged, wiping her hands on her apron. I don't have the luxury of telling people off. She gestured around the diner. This job keeps my family afloat. That's all that matters. The man watched her for a beat longer, then nodded. I respect that. Before Layla could say anything else, the woman in the booth waved her hand sharply, her gold bracelets clinking together. Waitress, we're ready for the check. Layla inhaled deeply, pressing her nails into her palm to ground herself. Just get through the night. Just like every other night. She turned back to the booth, but something about the way the man at the counter had looked at her stayed with her. Like he saw something in her that no one else ever had. And she had no idea how much her life was about to change. The offer that could change everything. The ding of the register was the only sound Layla heard as she processed the couple's payment. Her hands worked on autopilot, her mind still lingering on the quiet man at the counter. The door jingled as the wealthy couple left without another glance in her direction. No thank you. No tip. Just their judgment lingering in the air like the scent of overpriced perfume. Layla sighed, staring at the empty table. She had stopped expecting gratitude years ago. People like that treated the world like a stage, and people like her. Just background extras, silent, invisible, forgettable. She took a slow breath and reached for the coffee cup the man at the counter had left behind. But as she lifted it, something caught her eye. A slip of paper. No, a check. Her breath hitched in her throat. The numbers hit her like a physical blow. $10,000. For a moment, her brain refused to process it. She blinked, looked again. Maybe she was hallucinating. Maybe the long hours had finally broken her, but the numbers didn't change. $10,000. Her hand shook as she turned it over, barely registering the signature at the bottom. Elijah Carter. Her stomach twisted. She knew that name. Hands trembling, she fumbled for her phone and quickly typed it into Google. The search results loaded in seconds, and as she read, her heart pounded so loudly that she could barely hear anything else. Elijah Carter, billionaire, tech mogul, founder of Carter Industries, a man whose face was splashed across Forbes articles, investment magazines, and headlines about philanthropic efforts. A man who had been sitting in her diner, watching her, leaving her $10,000. Her chest tightened. This couldn't be real. She looked around, half expecting a hidden camera crew to jump out and yell surprise. You've been pranked. But the diner was quiet. the air thick with the lingering scent of coffee and bacon grease. It was real. Layla clutched the check, her thoughts spinning. Why? Why would a billionaire, someone who had more money than she could even comprehend, leave a struggling waitress enough money to change her life overnight? Was this a mistake? Some kind of social experiment? A joke? She pressed the check against her chest, her pulse hammering. Her first instinct was to reject it. Nothing in life was free. There was always a catch. Always. But before she could let the panic settle too deep, her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. A message. Unknown number. Check your email. Her mouth went dry. She had no idea how he had her number. Maybe from her work records, maybe from the payment system, maybe from some billionaire-level trick she would never understand. But she did know that this wasn't just a fluke. With trembling fingers, she opened her email. From Elijah Carter. Subject: a new opportunity. Layla, you probably have questions. The check is real. It's yours, no strings attached. But I don't just want to give you money. I want to give you something better. A chance. If you're interested in something more than just making it to the next shift, meet me tomorrow at Carter Industries. 12 p.m. sharp. My assistant will be waiting. If you choose not to, no hard feelings. Cash the check. Take care of your family. But if you want more, if you want a future, you'll be there. Elijah Carter. Layla's fingers hovered over the screen. A choice. She could take the money and walk away. Pay off some bills. Buy her little brother the new sneakers he needed. Maybe even take a few days off for once in her life. Or she could go to Carter Industries, to the billionaire's office, to him. Her mind screamed that it was too risky, too unbelievable. But her heart whispered, what if? What if this was real? What if this was the break she had been waiting for her entire life? She squeezed her eyes shut, her grip tightening on her phone. She had spent so long surviving, fighting, clawing for every inch just to keep from drowning. Was she finally being offered a life raft? She exhaled, her decision already made. She was going, and she had no idea what was waiting for her on the other side. The door to a new life. Layla stood outside the towering glass structure of Carter Industries, her fingers tightening around the strap of her worn-out purse. The skyscraper stretched into the sky like something out of a movie, its mirrored windows reflecting the sprawling skyline of Memphis, Tennessee. The air smelled different here, like polished floors, expensive cologne, and the kind of ambition she had never been allowed to dream of. This was a different world. And she didn't belong. Her heart pounded as she glanced down at her phone. 11:59 a.m. She was exactly on time. One deep breath, then another. She had spent the entire night tossing and turning, barely able to believe what had happened. The check, the email, the invitation. It felt like a dream. Except it wasn't. She had thought about backing out 100 times. Right up until the moment she stepped into the cab. But something had kept her moving forward. The same thing that had kept her working double shifts, scraping by, fighting to survive. Hope. What if this was real? Layla swallowed hard and forced her feet forward, through the glass doors and into the pristine, sunlit lobby. Inside, the building was even more overwhelming. Marble floors stretched endlessly beneath crystal chandeliers. Huge abstract paintings hung on the walls, their price tags probably more than she made in a year. Employees in tailored suits walked past her with purpose, barely sparing her a glance. She tugged at the hem of her jacket, painfully aware that her jeans and scuffed sneakers screamed out of place. A tall man in a sharp charcoal gray suit was waiting near the front desk. He had the crisp, polished look of someone who had been living in this world forever. "Miss Monroe?" he asked, his voice professional, but not unkind. She nodded, gripping her purse tighter. "Yes. I'm Daniel Hayes, Mr. Carter's assistant. If you'll follow me, he's expecting you." Her throat went dry. Oh God, this is real. With stiff legs, she followed Daniel past security checkpoints, through sleek, futuristic hallways where the carpet was so soft it felt like walking on clouds. Everything about this place was surreal. Too perfect, too polished. They reached an elevator, and Daniel pressed a button. The doors slid open, and they stepped inside. Layla stared at her reflection in the metal walls. What the hell am I doing here? Her sneakers looked absurd against the flawless flooring. Her hoodie, a practical choice against the Memphis chill, seemed ridiculous in a place where even the receptionists wore designer brands. The elevator rose fast. Her stomach dipped as the numbers climbed higher and higher. 28th floor, 29th, 30th. Then, ding. The doors opened, revealing an office so massive it could fit the entire diner she worked at inside. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, stretching out endlessly beneath the sky. Dark wood furniture, sleek black leather chairs, and a long glass desk occupied the space. And behind that desk, Elijah Carter. He wasn't a mystery anymore. He wasn't just some quiet man sitting at the counter, watching her. He was a billionaire, a tech mogul, a man who could change her life with a snap of his fingers. And right now, he was looking at her with the same calm, unreadable expression he had worn at the diner. "Miss Monroe," he said smoothly, "please have a seat." Layla hesitated. The chair in front of his desk looked expensive, like something she shouldn't touch, like something not meant for people like her. But then she remembered something. He had invited her here. So she forced herself forward, lowering onto the chair. She sat up straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Elijah leaned forward slightly, studying her like a puzzle he was trying to figure out. "I imagine you have questions." Layla let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "That's an understatement." Elijah smirked. Not a big smile, just the smallest tug at the corner of his lips. "Fair enough." He rested his forearms on the desk, interlocking his fingers. "I left you that check because I see something in you," he said, "and I wanted to see what you would do with it." Layla frowned. "What do you mean?" "You had two choices," he continued. "You could have taken the money and walked away, paid some bills, gone on with your life." Her stomach twisted. "And the second choice, to show up." His eyes locked onto hers. "To take a risk, to see if there was something more." Layla swallowed. "Why me?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Elijah leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Because I know what it's like." Layla blinked. "What?" "To be where you are," he said. "To feel stuck. To work yourself to the bone, and still barely scrape by." Her heart pounded. This man, this billionaire, was telling her he understood her struggle. "I wasn't always Elijah Carter, CEO," he continued, his voice quiet but firm. "I was a kid from nowhere, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep the lights on. I flipped burgers, cleaned floors. I worked graveyard shifts just to survive." Layla's breath caught in her throat. That was her life. She had spent so long believing that people like Elijah Carter were born into success, that billionaires were untouchable. But now he was sitting across from her, telling her he had once been her. "I know what it's like to be overlooked," he said. "To be treated like you don't matter. To wonder if you'll ever get out." Layla felt something tighten in her chest. "People gave me chances when I needed them most," he said. "And now I do the same." She stared at him. "So, the money." "It was never about the money," Elijah said. "It was about you." Layla's fingers curled around the fabric of her jeans. "What are you offering me?" she asked. Elijah slid a folder across the desk. Layla hesitated before picking it up. Her eyes scanned the first page. Carter Foundation. Community Outreach Coordinator. Full-time position. Salary, $85,000/year. Benefits included. Her breath hitched. She read it again. And again. $85,000. more money than she had ever seen in her life. "This position is for someone who understands struggle," Elijah said. "It's for someone who knows what it means to work hard, to fight, to survive." Layla felt her pulse in her ears. "It's not a handout," he added. "I don't give those." His eyes burned with quiet intensity. "It's an opportunity." She swallowed hard. "You think I can do this?" she asked. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "I know you can." Layla's hands trembled as she clutched the folder. This was real. A chance. A future. Her whole life had been spent struggling, scraping by, waiting tables, taking insults, pretending she didn't want more. And now, more was sitting right in front of her, waiting, daring her to take it. Her throat tightened as she exhaled slowly. Then, with a shaking hand, she reached for the pen and signed, walking into the unknown. Layla walked out of Carter Industries with her mind still spinning, the weight of the signed contract pressing against her chest. The folder felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of her entire future inside it. Because it does. She had spent years trying to hold her life together, barely keeping her head above water. But now she had a salary. A real salary. $85,000 a year. Benefits. Stability. A job that didn't involve standing on her feet for 15 hours, scrubbing counters, and swallowing her pride for a few extra bucks in tips. It was too much. Too unreal. Did I really just do that? The city stretched around her, but everything felt distant. The traffic, the honking, the conversations of people passing by. It was all just background noise to the storm inside her head. Her feet carried her down the sidewalk toward the nearest bus stop, though she barely registered the movement. Her brain was still stuck in Elijah Carter's office, replaying the conversation over and over again. He had seen her, not as a waitress, not as another struggling person trying to make ends meet, as something more. And that terrified her. She boarded the bus, dropping into a seat near the back. The cold metal pole under her fingertips grounded her as she stared out the window. Her reflection looked as lost as she felt. She needed to tell someone. Her mother. Her little brother, Jason. They would never believe this. They would think she was joking. Because people like them. They didn't get lucky. They didn't get chances. They survived. They pushed through. They worked themselves raw. And maybe, if they were lucky, they got to retire before their bodies gave out. Layla exhaled sharply. This wasn't luck. Luck was finding a $20 bill on the sidewalk. This was something else. This was a door opening. A door she had never even dreamed existed. And now she had a choice. Step through it or run away. Home, if you could call it that. The apartment building was the same as it had always been. Old. Tired, a little broken in places, just like the people who lived inside it. Layla climbed the stairs 2 at a time, her heart hammering. Her mother's apartment was on the 3rd floor, a cramped 2-bedroom unit that always smelled faintly of lavender, no matter how bad the building's plumbing was. She hesitated for half a second before pushing the door open. Her mother was in the tiny kitchen, hunched over the stove, stirring a pot of soup. Her thinning brown hair was pulled into a messy bun, and exhaustion sat in the lines on her face like an old friend. "Layla," her mother turned, surprised. "I thought you were working the night shift." Layla swallowed. She hesitated. How did she even begin? Her little brother Jason was sitting at the small wobbly table in the corner, sketching in one of his worn notebooks. He was 12, but already taller than most kids his age, his dark curls falling over his forehead as he focused. He glanced up at her. "Why do you look like you just saw a ghost?" Layla let out a breath. "Because I think I did." She dropped the folder onto the table. Her mother frowned, wiping her hands on a dish towel before sitting down. "What's this?" Layla sat across from her, Jason peering over her shoulder. "It's my new job contract," she said slowly. Silence. Her mother's brow creased. "What job?" Carter Foundation, Layla said, her own voice barely above a whisper. Her mother blinked. Jason, who had just taken a sip of his juice, choked. Wait, Carter? As in Elijah Carter? Layla nodded. More silence. Then, her mother shook her head. Layla. What? Layla exhaled, gripping the edge of the table. It's a long story. She told them everything. The diner, the couple, the quiet man at the counter, the check, the insane email, the job offer. By the time she was finished, Jason was gaping at her like she had just announced she had superpowers. Her mother, on the other hand, looked torn between shock and deep suspicion. Layla. Her mother's voice was careful. Did you sign it? Layla nodded. Her mother inhaled sharply. Are you sure this is real? That this isn't some kind of scam? Men like that, they don't just hand things to people like us. Layla understood the doubt. She felt the doubt. But she also knew what she had seen. She had sat across from Elijah Carter, looked him in the eyes, and felt the truth in his words. It's real, Mom, she said softly. Her mother still looked unconvinced. He just saw you and decided to change your life. Just like that. Layla hesitated before shaking her head. I don't think it was just like that. Her mother sighed, rubbing her temples. I don't know, baby. People like him don't do things for free. There's always a price. Layla stiffened. Jason, however, grinned. Are you kidding? This is crazy. My sister works for a billionaire now. We're basically famous. Layla rolled her eyes, but a smile tugged at her lips. Jason turned to their mother. Mom, if she's getting 85 grand a year, do you know what that means? We can actually afford stuff. She can stop working at that stupid diner. You can stop worrying about bills every month. Her mother pinched the bridge of her nose, like she was processing it all. I don't want you to get hurt, Layla. Layla swallowed. Neither do I. Her mother looked at her for a long time. Finally, she let out a sigh. Then, I guess you better make the most of it. First day, new world. The next morning, Layla found herself standing in front of Carter Industries again. Only this time, she wasn't just a visitor. She was an employee. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside. Daniel Hayes was already waiting in the lobby, his suit as perfect as ever. Miss Monroe. He gave a slight nod. Welcome to Carter Industries. Let's get you settled. Layla nodded, forcing herself to stand taller, even as her nerves twisted inside her. This was real. Her past life, working in a diner, barely scraping by, drowning under bills, was behind her. Ahead of her. She had no idea. But for the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was starting over. And that terrified her more than anything. Stepping into the unknown, Layla followed Daniel Hayes down a sleek hallway lined with glass-walled offices, each one filled with people who looked like they had been born for this kind of life. Polished, professional, powerful. She, on the other hand, felt like an imposter. Her new clothes, bought in a hurry with some of the tip money she had left, felt stiff and unfamiliar. The navy blue blouse and black slacks were a far cry from her diner uniform, and the brand-new heels pinched her feet. She was out of her element, and everyone could probably tell. Daniel led her to an elevator, scanning a keycard before stepping inside. The moment the doors shut, he glanced at her. You nervous? Layla clenched her fingers together. Is it that obvious? Daniel smirked. A little. She exhaled, pressing her palms against her thighs. I don't belong here. Daniel studied her for a moment before shaking his head. If Elijah Carter says you belong here, you belong here. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open. Layla took a deep breath and stepped into what felt like another world. This floor was different from the one she had visited yesterday. It wasn't Elijah Carter's massive office or some high-powered executive wing. It was warm. Large windows let in natural light, spilling across a workspace filled with sleek, modern furniture and bookshelves lined with binders. Plants sat on desks. There was a break room with a coffee machine better than the one at the diner. But what caught Layla's attention the most were the people. Unlike the corporate professionals downstairs, the employees here were diverse. Some wore business casual, others wore comfortable sweaters and sneakers. She saw a young woman with bright pink hair discussing a project with an older man in a cardigan. A man in a wheelchair was typing on his laptop while sipping coffee. It wasn't the cold, intimidating world she had feared. It felt human. Daniel gestured to a glass-walled office near the back. "That's your space." Layla blinked. "My space." He nodded. "You'll be working as a community outreach coordinator. That means you'll be handling initiatives, organizing events, and working with people who actually need help." Layla bit her lip. "So, I'll be helping people like you." Daniel finished for her. He gave a knowing nod. "Yeah." Something inside her chest twisted. She followed him into the office, where a real desk, a real computer, and a real nameplate that read Layla Monroe waited for her. This was hers. She ran a hand over the smooth surface of the desk, hardly able to believe it. Daniel pulled out a folder. "This is your first project." Layla sat down, her chair in her office, and took the folder. Her eyes scanned the words. Memphis Youth Assistance Program. Her throat tightened. It was a program designed to help struggling families, single parents, low-income households, kids who needed tutoring, meals, or a safe place after school. People like her family. She looked up at Daniel, her heart pounding. "I get to work on this. You'll be leading it." Layla felt like she couldn't breathe. She had spent her whole life watching her mother work 3 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. She had spent years trying to protect Jason from the same exhaustion, making sure he had food, books, and shoes that weren't falling apart. And now she had the chance to change that for other families. Daniel checked his watch. "Carter wants to see you in his office at noon. Until then, take some time to get settled." Layla barely registered his words. She wasn't just sitting in some random office. She was about to do something that mattered. For the first time in forever, she wasn't just struggling to survive. She was building something bigger than herself, and that terrified her. But it also made her feel something she had almost forgotten. Excitement. A meeting with the man who changed everything. Layla had spent her entire life making herself small. She had learned, at a young age, that people like her, people without money, without connections, without power, had to work twice as hard just to be seen, let alone valued. So, sitting in Elijah Carter's office for the second time in her life, knowing that this wasn't some fluke or mistake, felt utterly surreal. She shifted in her chair, hands clasped together, trying to ignore the nervous energy buzzing under her skin. The view from his office stretched out over the entire city, the skyline cutting sharp edges into the bright afternoon sky. It felt like she was sitting on top of the world. And yet, a part of her still wondered if she belonged. Elijah sat across from her, his presence just as commanding as before. He wasn't like the rich customers she had served at the diner, the ones who spoke down to her, who treated her like an afterthought. No, he was different. He was watching her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that felt measured, like he was waiting to see what she would do next. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "How's your first day?" Layla exhaled. "It's overwhelming." A small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "I figured." She swallowed. I saw the Memphis Youth Assistance Program. That's mine." Elijah nodded. "It's yours." Her hands tightened into fists. "That's a big deal. Why give it to someone like me?" Elijah's gaze sharpened. "Because you are a big deal, Layla. You just don't see it yet." Layla sucked in a breath. No one had ever said something like that to her before. No one had ever told her she was anything other than a survivor. A girl who worked hard, A girl who kept her head down and did what she had to do. But Elijah Carter, a billionaire, was sitting across from her, looking her straight in the eye and telling her she was more. Her throat tightened. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted. Elijah leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Good." She blinked. "Good." He nodded. "It means you'll ask questions. It means you'll learn. It means you'll put in the work instead of assuming you already have the answers." Layla's chest felt tight. "What if I fail?" Elijah tilted his head. "What if you succeed?" Her breath hitched. She hadn't thought about that. Her entire life had been spent avoiding failure, avoiding losing jobs, avoiding debt, avoiding anything that could send her deeper into a hole she couldn't climb out of. She had never allowed herself to think about success. And yet, Elijah Carter was pushing her toward it. She swallowed hard. "Why me?" Elijah's gaze darkened. "Because I know exactly who you are." Layla stiffened. "You don't." "I do," he interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "You think I found you by accident." Her pulse spiked. "Didn't you?" A small pause. Then, "No." Layla's stomach dropped. Elijah exhaled, glancing at the city beyond the windows before settling his eyes back on her. "I knew who you were before I ever walked into that diner." The air in the room shifted. Layla's breath caught in her throat. "What?" Elijah laced his fingers together. "I've been following your story for a while." She felt like the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. "How?" Elijah's expression didn't change. "Jason." Layla's heart stopped. Her little brother. Her hands went cold. "What about him?" Elijah leaned forward. "Your brother is a genius, Layla." She felt like she couldn't breathe. Jason had always been smart. He had always been too smart for the world around him. Layla had spent years watching him downplay his intelligence, hide what he could really do, because being the smartest kid in a low-income neighborhood wasn't safe. But what did Jason have to do with Elijah Carter? Elijah exhaled. "I have an AI mentorship program." Jason was flagged by our system as one of the top young minds in the country. Layla's stomach twisted. "Jason doesn't even have a computer," she whispered. Elijah nodded. "And yet he managed to outcode kids with the best resources money can buy." Layla felt nauseous. "You're telling me Jason, my 12-year-old brother, was competing against kids from elite schools?" Elijah's smirk returned. "And winning." Layla's pulse pounded in her ears. "How do you know it was him?" "Because he built something impressive," Elijah said simply. "And because he used your name when he submitted it." Layla's mind reeled. Jason had entered a competition under her name. Why didn't he tell me? Elijah's voice softened. "I wanted to meet the person who raised a kid like that." Layla's heart clenched. Elijah studied her for a long moment. "Jason is going to do big things, Layla. But he needs support. He needs someone to guide him." Layla's hands curled into fists. "He has me." Elijah nodded. "I know." A heavy silence settled between them. Then Elijah spoke again. "I brought you here because I see what you do for him. For your mother. For everyone around you." His voice was quieter now, but no less firm. "You don't just survive, Layla. You fight. And I don't think you even realize how rare that is." Layla swallowed against the lump in her throat. No one had ever seen her like this before. No one had ever said, "I see you." She looked down at the contract in front of her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Jason, about their future. Elijah watched her. "So tell me, Layla, are you ready for it?" Her fingers tightened around the pen. She had spent so much of her life believing she was meant for nothing more than scraping by. That life had already decided her fate. That she would always be the girl who worked double shifts, exhausted, invisible. But Elijah Carter was offering her a different path. She wasn't just signing a contract. She was choosing something more. Choosing herself. With one deep breath, she pressed the pen to paper. And signed. A new beginning. By the time Layla left Elijah's office, her hands were still shaking. Not from fear, from exhilaration. Her entire world had changed in the span of a single conversation. Jason was brilliant. A fact she had always known but never realized was being noticed by the world. And now she wasn't just working a job. She was walking into a future. For herself, for her family, for something more. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she deserved it. Walking into the future, Layla sat on the worn-out couch in her mother's tiny living room, staring down at the contract she had signed. It was real. She was real. The girl who had spent her entire life surviving had just been handed a future she never dared to dream about. And she was terrified. The low hum of the news played in the background, and her mother sat across from her at the kitchen table, quietly sipping tea. Jason, on the other hand, was pacing, his hands flying as he spoke. "You're telling me that Elijah freaking Carter knew about me?" he asked, eyes wide. "Because of a program I entered for fun." Layla nodded, still processing everything herself. Jason ran a hand through his messy curls. "And he gave you a job, because of me?" Her jaw tightened. "No, Jason. He gave me a job because of me." Jason froze, and her mother looked up from her tea. Layla hadn't meant to say it so sharply, but it was the truth. For years, she had felt like she was just barely keeping her family together, like her entire existence was about working herself into the ground just to make sure everyone else was okay. And for the first time, someone had seen her. Not just as Jason's sister, not just as a struggling waitress, not as some background character in other people's lives, but as someone who mattered. Jason swallowed. "Sorry," he muttered. This is a lot." Layla softened. "I know." Her mother set her cup down. "Do you trust him?" Layla exhaled. Did she trust Elijah Carter? She thought about the way he had looked at her, not like she was a charity case, not like she was beneath him, but like she was someone worth investing in. She thought about the way he had talked about Jason, like her little brother was more than just a smart kid in a bad situation. Like he was brilliant, like he was limitless. I do," she admitted. Her mother nodded slowly, but Layla could still see the worry in her eyes. "I just don't want you to get hurt, baby. People with money, they don't do things for free." Layla swallowed hard. "I don't think this is free." Her mother frowned. "What do you mean?" Layla set the contract down and stared at it. "This isn't a gift," she murmured. "This is a responsibility. He's not giving me money to make me feel good about myself. He's giving me a job, a real one. One where I have to prove I deserve it." Her mother's face softened. "Then do it," Jason said suddenly. Layla turned to him. Jason's hands clenched into fists. "Prove you belong there. Show them that people like us deserve chances too." Something inside Layla clicked. Jason had never needed her to rescue him. He had never needed anyone to fight his battles for him. He was strong, too strong for a 12-year-old. But he had needed hope, and now she had a chance to give it to him. Layla took a deep breath and nodded. "I will." The first test. Layla arrived at Carter Foundation headquarters the next morning, gripping her tote bag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had spent the night studying, researching everything she could about nonprofit work, community outreach, and the Memphis Youth Assistance Program. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it right. She had just walked into the office when Daniel Hayes greeted her with a nod. "Carter wants to see you." Layla's stomach twisted. Already. She followed Daniel through the halls, trying not to feel out of place among people who had probably been working in nonprofit development for years. When she stepped into Elijah Carter's office, he was standing by the window, his hands in his pockets. "You're early," he noted without turning around. Layla shifted. "I don't like being late." Elijah turned, his sharp gaze studying her. "Good. He gestured to the seat across from his desk, and she sat, forcing herself to keep her shoulders back. "This job isn't going to be easy," he said. "People in these communities, kids like your brother, families like yours, they don't trust easily. They've been let down before. Some of them think people like me, people with money, only show up when cameras are rolling." Layla swallowed hard. "I know." Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "Then you also know that earning their trust is the hardest part." She nodded. He leaned forward. "Tell me, Layla, how you plan to do that?" Layla's pulse pounded. She had thought about this all night. She had seen programs come and go, rich donors throwing money at problems without ever truly understanding them. And she knew one thing for sure: money wasn't enough. "They need to see me," she said firmly. "Not in an office, not in a press release, in their world." Elijah raised an eyebrow. Layla leaned forward. "I want to start small. A neighborhood outreach event. No fancy catering. No PR stunts. Just real conversations. Let them tell me what they need, instead of me assuming I already know." Elijah was silent for a moment. Then he smirked. "You learn fast." Layla exhaled. "Is that a yes?" Elijah reached for his phone and sent a quick message. "I'll have my team help set it up," he said simply. "But this is your event, Layla. Your test." Layla nodded, ignoring the fear curling in her stomach. She had spent her whole life waiting for something to change. And now, she was the one making it happen. The day everything changed. The neighborhood center wasn't anything fancy. It was an old brick building with faded murals on the walls and a small playground out front. Layla stood in the middle of it, heart pounding as families slowly started showing up. She had expected skepticism, and she wasn't wrong. Mothers with tired eyes watched her carefully. Kids clung to their parents, unsure of what to expect. A few teenagers stood off to the side, arms crossed, eyes filled with doubt. Layla took a deep breath and stepped forward. She didn't have a speech prepared. She didn't have scripted answers. She only had her story. So, she told it. She told them about working at the diner, about barely making ends meet, about what it felt like to always be on the edge of breaking, and what it meant to keep pushing forward anyway. And slowly, they listened. They started to talk. They told her about their struggles, about what they needed, what had been promised before but never delivered. By the end of the day, something had shifted. Layla wasn't just some outsider in a suit. She was one of them. And for the first time, she knew. She was exactly where she was meant to be. A future worth fighting for. That night, Layla sat on the steps outside the neighborhood center, exhausted but alive. Elijah Carter walked up beside her. "You did good today," he said. Layla exhaled, her hands clasped together. "It's just the beginning." Elijah nodded. "That's the point." Layla looked at him. "Why me?" Elijah met her gaze. "Because you were never just meant to survive," he said quietly. "You were meant to change things." Layla's chest tightened. For the first time in her life, she believed him. A new chapter begins. Layla sat on the cold concrete steps of the neighborhood center, staring at the quiet street in front of her. The event had ended hours ago, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to leave yet. Not because she was tired, though exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, but because she was processing. This was the first time in her life that she had felt like she was part of something bigger than just survival. Her entire life had been spent scraping by, working double shifts, stretching every dollar, making sacrifices to ensure her family stayed afloat. Now, for the first time, she wasn't just trying to survive. She was building something. And that terrified her. Beside her, Elijah Carter stood with his hands in his pockets, watching her carefully. "You're still doubting yourself." It wasn't a question. Layla let out a small laugh, shaking her head. I can't shake the feeling that I don't belong here." Elijah was quiet for a moment before he spoke. When I was building Carter Industries, there wasn't a single day I didn't feel like a fraud. Layla turned to him, eyebrows raised. You? Elijah smirked. You think I walked into boardrooms and felt like I belonged? Hell no. I was a kid from nowhere. I didn't go to Ivy League schools. I didn't come from money. And every time I stood in front of a group of investors, I thought, what the hell am I doing here? Layla swallowed hard. Elijah exhaled. But then I realized something. It wasn't about belonging. It was about showing up anyway. Layla stared down at her hands. Showing up anyway. She had spent so long trying to prove she was worthy of something more, trying to convince herself that maybe one day she'd be more than just a struggling waitress. But she didn't need to wait for someone to tell her she belonged. She just had to keep showing up. She looked back at Elijah, her expression steady. You really think I can do this? Elijah's eyes were unwavering. I wouldn't have chosen you if I didn't. A breath of air left her lungs, and for the first time in a long time, she felt steady. She wasn't in the diner anymore. She wasn't just fighting to keep her head above water. She was changing lives, including her own. The end of one story, the beginning of another. A week later, Layla sat at her own desk in Carter Foundation's headquarters, reviewing documents for the next outreach project. She had met with school principals, social workers, and community leaders. She had listened, she had learned, and she had made a plan, not just for the foundation. For herself. She was going to make a difference. She was going to help families like hers, and she was going to prove, to herself, to the world, that people like her weren't just meant to survive. They were meant to thrive. And for the first time in her life, Layla Monroe felt something new. Hope. And this time, she wasn't letting go of it.